That old pond's a mosquito farm, not a fire plan, Marsha Kingsley said, tapping her clipboard against my truck's tailgate. The board already voted. Tuesday, 2:47 p.m., bulldozers roll, Thursday. I didn't say anything. I just watched the sun catch the diamond on her hand and thought about my grandfather, 40 years dead, who dug that pond with a rented dragline in 1931 so the county wouldn't have to watch this ranch burn. Here's what the homeowners in Willow Creek Estates didn't know that Tuesday afternoon. 46 houses, 1 water source, 0 backup. Here's what they also didn't know. The splash pad Marsha was building would cost $2.3 million. 14 inches of concrete poured straight over 90 years of watershed. 380,000 gallons pumped out and dumped into a drainage ditch in one afternoon, because nobody on that board bothered to ask a single hydrologist a single question. I know, because for 31 years, asking those questions was my job. By the time this story ends, Marsha Kingsley will owe $2.3 million to people who trusted her with their homeowners' dues. She'll learn, in front of a courtroom and a news camera, that in the state of Texas, water doesn't follow property lines, it follows paper. And the paper, filed in a manila folder in a records office in Austin since 1962, has my family's name on it. She didn't know that yet. Neither did I, not fully, not the size of it. The day she stood on my grandfather's land in $400 boots and told me the pond was an eyesore that's held this community back. What I did know was smaller, and it was enough to start with. A little thing, a paperwork thing. The kind of thing that seems like nothing until it isn't. I want you to remember the sound of that afternoon, because it's the sound this whole story turns on. It was the sound of a diesel pump running for 6 straight hours, sucking my family's fire reserve dry into a ditch, while 46 families a half-mile away went on believing that if their house ever caught fire, water would come out of the hydrant on the corner. It would. For now. Where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. I want to know how many of you have an HOA sitting on top of something they don't understand. My name is Walter Dunmore. I'm 64 years old. I spent my career reading water the way some men read scripture. And when Marsha Kingsley drained my grandfather's ponds to build a wading pool for other people's grandkids, she didn't just take my water. She handed me the one thing I'd spent 3 decades learning how to use. The Dunmore Ranch sits on 412 acres of Blanco County limestone and cedar scrub, 40 minutes outside Austin, close enough now that the city's sprawl finally caught up to us. My great-grandfather Ezra Dunmore homesteaded it in 1899. There's a ledger in the house, leather cracked down the spine, where he wrote the date the well went dry that first summer, and the date, 3 weeks later, when he found the spring that saved the herd. I still have his desk, hand-built mesquite wood, dovetail joints he cut himself with a handsaw because there wasn't a lumber mill within 30 miles. My laptop sits on it now, which feels like some kind of joke Ezra would have appreciated. My grandfather, Otto Dunmore, is the one who matters most to this story. In 1931, after watching 2 ranches burn to nothing because the closest water was an hour away by wagon, Otto hired a man with a steam dragline and dug a 4-acre pond on the low end of our land, fed by a spring that never quit even in the 50s drought. He didn't do it for looks. He did it so that if fire ever came through that country, there'd be something to fight it with. In 1962, when the county started platting land for what would eventually become Willow Creek Estates, Otto did something almost nobody bothered to do back then. He filed for an adjudicated water right on that pond and the spring beneath it, through the state engineer's office, naming it explicitly as a fire protection reserve. He paid $11 in filing fees. He kept the receipt stapled inside that same leather ledger. When Blanco County eventually ran hydrant lines out to the new subdivision going up next door, the engineers tapped straight into Otto's pond because it was the only reliable year-round source for 6 miles. Nobody asked Otto if that was permanent. Nobody had to. The water right made it a matter of law, not neighborliness. My father inherited the ranch in 1978. He's buried on a rise above the pond, next to my mother, next to Otto, next to Otto's wife, Marguerite. 3 generations, under cedar trees my great-grandfather planted as saplings. When the wind comes up off that pond in the evening, it smells like cut hay and diesel from the old pump house. And if I close my eyes, I could be 8 years old again, standing next to my grandfather while he showed me how to read the water line on the dam wall. I came home to this ranch 2 years ago after my wife Carol passed, after 31 years working as a licensed hydrologist for the Texas Water Development Board, measuring aquifers, filing right of capture reports, testifying in water disputes from the Panhandle to the Valley. I know how adjudicated rights work. I know how HOA boards work too, which is to say, mostly they don't. Most residents never read the CC&Rs past page 4. Most boards run on volunteers who've never opened the Texas Water Code in their lives. Marsha Kingsley definitely hadn't. Marsha is 52, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for 6 years running, unopposed the last 4, because nobody wants to spend their Tuesday nights arguing with her. She drives a white Range Rover, the big one, the one that costs more than my truck and Otto's original pickup combined. She wears designer blazers to HOA meetings held in a community center that still has folding chairs from 1994. She carries a clipboard everywhere, like it's a badge, like it grants her jurisdiction. Her husband, Rick Kingsley, owns Kingsley Premier Builders. Guess who got the $2.3 million contract to redevelop the underutilized recreational water feature? That's what the board resolution called my grandfather's fire pond into a splash pad, cabana, and resort-style amenity center for Willow Creek Estates. I didn't know about that contract yet, standing there that Tuesday. I just knew Marsha Kingsley was telling me, without asking, that bulldozers were coming Thursday to finish draining what her pump had already started. That's my land, I told her. She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you don't matter. The pond's not on your side of the survey line, Mr. Dunmore. We checked. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet, and I wasn't going to be the one to tell her. The bulldozer came Thursday, just like she said it would, 8:14 a.m., according to the timestamp on my phone. I stood on the rise by the family graves, camera up, and I filmed the whole thing without saying a word. 2 dump trucks, a skid steer, a crew foreman named Deke who wouldn't meet my eyes, and a laminated document zip-tied to the pump house door that Marsha's assistant had stapled up the night before. A notice of violation, citing me for maintaining an unauthorized water hazard in violation of Willow Creek Estates CC&R Section 7.3b. I'd read the CC&Rs, all 91 pages, twice the week after Marsha first mentioned the pond situation at a neighborhood coffee I hadn't wanted to attend. My grandfather's ranch isn't in the HOA, never was. Otto sold the platted acreage to the county in 1961, kept 412 acres for himself, and that parcel has never once been subject to Willow Creek Estates covenants. Section 7.3b doesn't apply to me any more than it applies to the moon. But I didn't say that. Not yet. I photographed the notice. I photographed the tire tracks already cutting fresh gouges through my grandfather's cedar windbreak. I photographed the intake valve on the pump house, where a chain now hung with a combination lock that wasn't mine. Then I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and asked for a deputy to document trespass, because in Texas, calling the law on somebody before you do anything else is worth more than 100 angry phone calls. Deputy Ruiz showed up at 9:52 a.m., wrote his report, took his own photos, and told the foreman to stand his crew down until ownership got sorted out. Deke looked relieved. I don't think he'd wanted to be there either. That's when Marsha showed up in the Range Rover, gravel spraying under those big tires, clipboard already in hand like a woman walking into a meeting she expected to win. Mr. Dunmore. She didn't get out right away. She sat there behind tinted glass long enough to make a point before she finally opened the door. I don't know what the confusion is. The board approved this project in March. We have the engineering reports, we have the permits. You have permits to build on land you don't own, I said. This parcel's never been inside your HOA boundary. She laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, the laugh of someone who genuinely believes the world works the way she's been told it works. Our surveyor pulled the plat. This pond sits on association-designated open space. Your surveyor's wrong, or your surveyor was told what answer you wanted. That's when the smile finally came off her face. You need to take that up with legal counsel then, because as of this morning, the board has issued you a formal fine of $2,000 a day for maintaining a hazardous, unpermitted water feature that endangers the health and safety of our residents' children. That fine accrues starting today. Here's what most homeowners don't know and what Marsha Kingsley clearly didn't either. An HOA board cannot fine a property owner who isn't a member of that HOA. Fining authority under Texas Property Code Chapter 209 only extends to properties actually subject to a recorded declaration. You can write whatever number you want on whatever letterhead you want. If the underlying authority doesn't exist, the number is fiction. $2,000 a day times infinity is still zero if the paper it's printed on has no teeth. I didn't tell her that either. I just said, "You'll want to get that fine notice in writing and send it certified mail. I'll want a copy for my file." "You'll get it," she said, sliding back into the Range Rover. "And Mr. Dunmore, the water's already been pumped out. There's no saving what's already gone." She was right about that part. By the time Deputy Ruiz left, the pond that had sat 4 acres deep and full since 1931 was a cracked mudflat. Herons picking through the shallows for stranded bluegill, and 380,000 gallons of my grandfather's fire reserve were sitting in a drainage ditch a mile away, soaking into somebody's bar ditch instead of standing ready for the next grass fire. I documented that too. Time-stamped photos of the empty basin, a certified letter to the HOA's registered agent, return receipt requested, stating my ownership and demanding immediate cessation of any construction. A second certified letter to Rick Kingsley's construction company. A call to my attorney, an old friend named Phyllis Trammell, who'd handled Otto's estate 30 years back and still had every scrap of paper in a fireproof file cabinet in her office in Blanco. "Walter," she said when I brought her the folder, "you understand what you're sitting on here, don't you?" I thought I did. I'd been a licensed hydrologist for 3 decades. I knew Otto had filed for a water right back in '62. What I didn't fully understand, not yet, not until Phyllis pulled the certified copy from the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality's water rights database 3 days later, was the scope of it. It wasn't just the right to store water on Otto's own land. Under the Texas Water Rights Adjudication Act of 1967, Otto's 1962 filing had been formally adjudicated in 1971 as a Certificate of Adjudication, Certificate number 5-3287, if you want the number, because I've since memorized it, granting Otto Dunmore and his heirs the sole appropriative right to the spring-fed aquifer segment beneath both his land and what later became the Willow Creek Estates subdivision. When the county ran hydrant lines to the new development in 1974, they didn't drill their own well. They tapped directly into Otto's certificated source under an easement agreement that explicitly named his pond as the reserve supply point, an agreement that had never been renegotiated, never been terminated, and was still, 50 years later, sitting active in county records. Every hydrant in Willow Creek Estates, 46 houses, 1 fire station's mutual aid agreement, all of it ran back to a 4-acre pond on my land that Marsha Kingsley had just spent an afternoon pumping dry for a splash pad. That was the small shield, and it was already enough to stop her cold, but I still didn't know why she was in such a hurry to build something that expensive on land she didn't even legally control. That question is what sent me down to the county clerk's office 3 days later, and that's where I met Dorothy Callahan. Dorothy was standing at the counter ahead of me, 80-something, oxygen tubing looping under her nose to a little green tank on wheels, going round and round with a clerk about a lien filing she didn't understand. She'd served as an army nurse in Vietnam in 1969 and 70. She told me that within the first 5 minutes, the way people her age sometimes do, like it explains everything else about them, and it usually does. Her husband Frank had died 11 years back. She lived alone now in a little brick house on Sycamore Court, 2 streets over from Marsha's, and she'd just been notified by certified letter, same as me, that the HOA was placing a lien against her home for $11,000 in special assessment fees tied to the splash pad renovation. I never voted for any of this, she told the clerk, and then, turning to me because I was the only one listening, I told them I'm on a fixed income. I told them Frank's pension doesn't stretch that far. Marsha said if I couldn't pay, they'd have to explore other options. Other options. I knew what that meant. Foreclosure through an HOA assessment lien is legal in Texas under narrow conditions, and boards that don't understand the limits of that power love to wave it at people who can't afford a lawyer to push back. I helped Dorothy get a copy of her lien notice, and while the clerk pulled it, I asked, almost as an afterthought, to see the recorded contract behind the special assessment, the one authorizing $2.3 million in HOA funds for the Willow Creek Resort Amenity Project. The clerk slid it across without blinking, because public record is public record, and that's the moment the whole thing turned into something much bigger than a fight over my grandfather's pond. The general contractor listed on the recorded contract was Kingsley Premier Builders LLC, Rick Kingsley's company. Sole-sourced, no competitive bid, approved by a 4-to-1 board vote where Marsha herself cast the deciding tiebreaker after 2 independent bids from other contractors, both of which, I'd later learn, had been submitted by companies that shared a registered agent address with Kingsley Premier Builders. The contract price was $2.3 million. The actual line item costs I found buried 3 pages deep: concrete, plumbing, decking, permitting, totaled just under $1.56 million. $740,000 unaccounted for, moving from homeowner dues and special assessments, assessments like the $11,000 about to take Dorothy Callahan's house into a construction company owned by the HOA president's husband. I stood there in that fluorescent-lit records office with Dorothy's oxygen tank humming beside me, and I thought about Otto Dunmore paying $11 in 1962 to protect a pond nobody thought would ever matter again. It mattered now. It mattered more than Marsha Kingsley could possibly imagine. Dorothy was still fussing with the strap on her oxygen tank when I turned back to her. "Mrs. Callahan," I said, "would you mind if I made a copy of that lien letter for my own files?" "Call me Dorothy," she said. "Everybody does. And I don't mind at all, though I don't know what good it'll do either one of us." Her hands shook a little, folding the paper back along its creases, the kind of shake that comes from age and not fear, though I suspect that day she had plenty of both. Frank always said HOAs were how people who never fought a war find something to feel powerful about. I laughed before I could stop myself, and the clerk behind the counter, a heavy-set woman named Alba, who'd clearly heard this particular complaint before, gave a tired little smile of her own. "You're not the first one in here this month about Willow Creek," Alba said, sliding my copy across. "Had a fellow from Cedar Bend Court in here Tuesday asking about a lien on his mother's place. 91 years old, that lady. They came after her for the assessment too." That detail sat in my chest like a stone the rest of the drive home. I kept picturing Marsha Kingsley's clipboard, the way she held it against her hip like a shield, like paperwork made a thing true just by existing. I thought about Otto's ledger back on that mesquite desk, the ink faded, but the handwriting still sure, still deliberate, a man who understood that water was the one thing in this country nobody could bluff their way around. I drove Dorothy home myself that afternoon, her little oxygen tank rattling in my truck bed, wrapped in a moving blanket so it wouldn't tip. Her house on Sycamore Court was small and neat, a wind chime made from spent shotgun shells hanging by the porch. Frank's, she told me, made after he came home in '71. She stood on her step a long moment before going in. "They can't really take a house over $11,000, can they?" she asked. I didn't lie to her. "They can try," I said. "Depends how hard they're willing to fight and how hard we're willing to fight back." She looked at me then the way people look at you when they've decided, right then, to trust you with something. You fixing to fight back, Mr. Dunmore? Walter, I said, and yes, ma'am, I believe I am. She nodded slow, like that settled something, and went inside to her little brick house with its wind chime made of memory, and I drove back toward the ranch with Rick Kingsley's construction contract folded in my glove box and $740,000 unaccounted dollars sitting heavy behind my eyes. The dark truck cameras I'd bolted to the pump house corners picked up everything at 6:03 a.m. the following Saturday. Bolt cutters, Marsha Kingsley's own hands, not a hired man's, snapping the chain I'd put on the intake valve after the sheriff's visit. She was still in what looked like yoga clothes, hair pulled back, moving fast in the grey morning light, like she thought nobody would ever see this except the fish. I saw it that afternoon when I pulled the footage. I watched her force the valve wheel with a pipe wrench, watched the last standing water in the basin, maybe 8 inches, all that was left after the pumping, drain out through a trench her husband's crew had already cut, straight across my fence line and onto county right-of-way, right past the rise where Otto and Marguerite and my parents are buried under the cedars. She didn't stop at the valve. The crew came behind her an hour later with a track hoe, widened that trench another 6 feet, and in doing it they clipped the corner of the low stone wall my father built around the family plot in 1979. Not much, a few feet of stacked limestone knocked loose and scattered, but I have 4 generations of Dunmores resting up there, and watching a stranger's excavator bucket swing that close to my mother's headstone did something to me I hadn't expected. My hands were shaking by the time I stopped the footage. That's Texas Penal Code Section 28.03, Criminal Mischief, and Section 30.05, Criminal Trespass, both committed in daylight, both on camera, both by the president of the HOA personally. I didn't call the sheriff that day. I wanted to. Every instinct in me wanted a squad car in that driveway within the hour. But Phyllis Trammell had already told me something I needed to hear more than I wanted to hear it. Walter, you file this piecemeal, she lawyers up on a trespass charge and walks with probation and a fine she pays out of the HOA's insurance. You want this to matter, you build the whole case at once, and you let the water do what the water's going to do. Patience is the weapon here, not anger. So I sat with the footage. I logged it, time-stamped, backed up in 3 places, a copy hand-delivered to Deputy Ruiz's supervisor with a cover letter from Phyllis explaining exactly what statutes applied, so that when the moment came, nobody in that department would need to think twice. Here's what most homeowners don't know. Filing a criminal complaint and filing for civil enforcement are 2 entirely different clocks, and you can run them side by side without either one interfering with the other. While the trespass complaint sat quietly in a file at the sheriff's office, I filed something else entirely. A formal request under Texas Water Code Section 11.326 asking the Regional Watermaster's Office to intervene and confirm the priority and validity of Certificate Number 5-3287. I also filed, through Phyllis, a cease and desist letter under Section 11.081, citing unauthorized diversion of water from an adjudicated source, served not just on the HOA, but on Rick Kingsley's construction company directly, and on the HOA's insurance carrier, because insurance carriers have a wonderful way of making boards suddenly very cautious once they realize a claim might not be covered. I also drove out to the Blanco County Fire Marshal's office and sat down with a woman named Chief Renata Ibarra, who'd been fighting grass fires in that county for 22 years. I laid Otto's certificate on her desk, along with the 1974 easement agreement naming the pond as the reserve supply point for the subdivision's hydrant system. She read it twice. "You're telling me every hydrant in Willow Creek runs off this," she said, tapping the paper. "Every one," I said. "And right now, that source is bone dry because the HOA drained it for a splash pad." Chief Ibarra didn't say much else that day, but she made a phone call before I even left the parking lot, and I understood then that I wasn't the only person in Blanco County who was about to start paying very close attention to Marsha Kingsley. It was around this same time that Dorothy Callahan's health took a turn, and I still believe to this day that Marsha's people pushed her into it on purpose. The HOA's attorney, a sharp young man named Colton Reese, who clearly hadn't yet learned to ask questions before signing his name to things, sent Dorothy a second notice. This one titled Notice of Trustee Sale, scheduling an auction of her home on the courthouse steps in 45 days over the $11,000 lien. Under Texas Property Code, Section 209.0092, an HOA seeking foreclosure over an unpaid assessment has to jump through real hoops: notice, opportunity to cure, in some cases a judge's involvement, for anything tied to less than the full assessment amount owed on a homestead. Colton Reese either didn't know that or didn't care. The letter Dorothy got in her mailbox that Tuesday didn't mention any of her rights. It just told her she had 45 days to pay or lose the house Frank had bought for her in 1974. She called me that evening, voice thin over the phone, oxygen concentrator humming loud enough in the background that I could hear it through the line. "Walter, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't have $11,000. I don't have $1,100. I drove over, found her sitting at her kitchen table with the letter in front of her and Frank's old service photo turned face down, like she couldn't stand to have him watching her like this. Her hands were trembling worse than usual, and by the time I got her calmed down enough to eat something, her lips had gone a little blue at the edges, and I made the call myself. The ambulance took her in for observation, anxiety on top of her COPD, the ER doctor said. Nothing permanent, but her heart rate had spiked high enough to scare everybody in that room, including me. I sat in that hospital waiting room past midnight, and somewhere in there, I stopped thinking about water rights and started thinking about what kind of people build a $2 million splash pad on the back of an 80-year-old widow's mortgage. That was my low point, if I'm honest with you. Not the pond, not the graves. Dorothy, in a hospital bed, oxygen line taped under her nose, asking a nurse in a small voice whether they'd really take her house while she was still in here. I sat out at the cemetery on the rise 2 nights later, after she'd been released, after I knew she was stable, and I talked to my father's headstone the way a man does when he's tired and nobody else is listening. I told him I had it in my power to shut off the water to 46 houses in the middle of a dry Texas summer, and that some of those houses had nothing to do with Marsha Kingsley or her husband's construction company. Good people, families, kids on bicycles, none of whom had voted for any of this. I told him I didn't know if closing that valve made me any better than the woman who emptied the pond in the first place. The wind came up through the cedars, the way it always does out there in the evening, and I didn't get an answer. Not really, not the kind you can quote. But I thought about the fire marshal's face when she read that easement. I thought about the difference between a man protecting what the law already says is his and a woman stealing from a widow to build a water slide. Otto didn't file that certificate to punish anybody. He filed it to make sure water existed when it was needed. I decided that night I wasn't going to be the one who created the danger. Marsha already had. All I intended to do was stop pretending the danger wasn't real, in front of everyone who needed to see it. So I stopped waiting to feel entirely at peace about it, and I started building the trap properly. Permits pulled for the valve inspection I had every legal right to conduct on my own property. Written notice sent to the regional watermaster, requesting his presence for what Texas Water Code Section 11.326 calls a priority enforcement action, and a quiet phone call to a reporter I'd known for 15 years, a woman named Carla Pruitt at the Austin station, who'd once done a story on my testimony in a hill country water dispute and had been chasing HOA corruption stories for a year. "I've got documents," I told her. "I've got footage. And in about 2 weeks, I'm going to need a camera in the right place at the right time." "Give me the date," Carla said, "and I'll be there." I gave her a date, then I went back to the ranch, and for the first time since Marsha Kingsley stood in my driveway with her clipboard, I felt something close to steady. The date I gave Carla Pruitt was a Thursday, high summer. The kind of Texas afternoon where the air shimmers off the asphalt and every ranch in the county starts watching the horizon for smoke. Temperature that day hit 104. The National Weather Service had a red flag warning up for half the hill country. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of day my grandfather dug that pond to prepare for. I stood at the pump house at 2:47 p.m. Same hour, I noticed, that Marcia had first stood in my driveway with her clipboard weeks before, telling me the bulldozers would roll Thursday. There's a symmetry in that I didn't plan but noticed all the same. I wasn't alone. Regional Watermaster Hal Brennan stood beside me with a certified copy of certificate number 5-3287 in a manila folder under his arm. Chief Renata Ibarra stood a few feet off in her fire marshal's uniform, arms crossed, watching the gauge on the empty basin. Deputy Ruiz was there, along with a second deputy and a patrol sergeant, all of whom had been fully briefed by Phyllis on exactly what statutes were in play. Carla Pruitt stood off to the side with a cameraman, red light already blinking. And behind all of them, in a folding lawn chair someone had carried down from her porch, sat Dorothy Callahan, oxygen tank at her feet, because I'd called her that morning and told her she deserved to see this happen with her own eyes. I'd sent notice 5 days prior, certified mail, same as always, to the HOA board, to Rick Kingsley's company, and to the county, stating that as the sole certificate holder of record, I would be exercising my adjudicated priority right and formally requesting the watermaster close the shared intake gate that fed both my remaining reserve and, downstream, the entire Willow Creek Estates hydrant loop, pending resolution of unauthorized diversion. Texas Water Code Section 11.081 gave me every right to make that request. I wasn't stealing anything. I was simply declining, for the first time in 50 years, to let anyone borrow water they'd never once asked permission to use. Marcia showed up at 3:10, Range Rover skidding into the gravel lot outside the pump house, Colton Reese climbing out of the passenger side, already talking before his door was shut. "Mr. Dunmore, you cannot unilaterally shut off water to an entire subdivision. This is—" "He's not doing anything unilaterally," Hal Brennan said, stepping forward with the folder open. "I'm doing it, on the authority of a certificate of adjudication issued by the state of Texas in 1971, confirming Mr. Dunmore's family is the sole appropriative rights holder for this entire basin. Your subdivision's hydrant system has been drawing on his priority water under an easement since 1974. That easement required maintaining the reserve source in usable condition. It doesn't require Mr. Dunmore to refill a reservoir your board drained without his consent." Marcia's face did something I'd been waiting weeks to see. The particular kind of collapse that happens when a person who has never once been told no in a room she controls suddenly hears it from someone she can't out-clipboard. "This is insane," she said. "You're going to leave 46 houses without fire protection in 104-degree heat because of a grudge over a wading pool?" "No, ma'am," Chief Ibarra said, quiet and even. "You did that the day you drained the reserve. Mr. Dunmore's just the only one who's told anybody the truth about it since." That's when the gate turned. Hal Brennan gave the order, a county utility worker cranked the head valve at the shared junction closed, and somewhere down the line, in 46 houses, hydrant pressure that had already been running dangerously low from the drained reserve dropped to nothing. It would show up within the hour on the fire department's own monitoring system, a system Chief Ibarra had already flagged as compromised 3 days earlier in a formal memo to the county that named Willow Creek Estates explicitly and cited both the empty reserve pond and Marcia's unauthorized diversion as contributing causes. It was that memo, sitting on file with the county fire marshal, cross-referenced against the criminal mischief footage I'd handed Deputy Ruiz's supervisor weeks before, that gave the sheriff's department everything they needed. The second deputy stepped forward with a printed warrant Phyllis had pushed hard for exactly this timing. Criminal charges served the same afternoon as the civil enforcement, so there'd be no time for Marcia's lawyer to get ahead of the story. "Marcia Kingsley," the sergeant said, You're under arrest for criminal mischief and criminal trespass in connection with the destruction of a fire suppression reserve on private property. Carla's camera caught every second of it. The clipboard hit the gravel when they turned her around. Her hands, so used to gesturing at people, went behind her back instead, and I watched her face turn toward Dorothy Callahan, sitting in that lawn chair with her oxygen tubing catching the light, and for 1 second, just one, I saw something like recognition pass over Marsha's face, like she finally understood whose $11,000 had helped pay for the concrete now sitting where my grandfather's pond used to be. "You can't do this," Marsha said, to no one in particular as they walked her to the patrol car. "The board authorized everything. Everything was approved." "The board didn't authorize criminal mischief," Deputy Ruiz said, "and it sure didn't authorize your husband's company skimming $740,000 off a $2.3 million contract." That number, spoken out loud, in front of a running news camera, was the moment the story stopped being about a pond at all. The reservoir stayed offline for 11 days while the county ran an emergency temporary line from a municipal main 3 miles east, at a cost of $61,000 billed directly to Willow Creek Estates' HOA reserve fund, not to me, because Texas Water Code Section 11.086 makes clear that unauthorized diversion damages fall on the party who caused them. The investigation that followed Marsha's arrest moved fast, mostly because Carla Pruitt's story ran that same night, and 3 other homeowners came forward within a week with records of their own inflated assessments. Rick Kingsley's construction company had been billing Willow Creek Estates for phantom change orders since 2019, $740,000 total, exactly matching the gap I'd found in the county records, funneled through invoices for site preparation and engineering contingencies that a forensic accountant later testified were never performed. Marsha Kingsley pled guilty to criminal mischief, criminal trespass, and, once the Attorney General's office got involved, misapplication of fiduciary property under Texas Penal Code Section 32.45 for diverting HOA-controlled funds through her husband's company. She was sentenced to 4 years, with 2 suspended, and ordered to pay $740,000 in restitution to the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, plus the $61,000 emergency waterline cost, plus $38,000 in civil penalties under the Water Code for the unauthorized diversion, $839,000 in total, every dollar of it hers and Rick's to pay, none of it covered by HOA insurance, since the carrier had already denied the claim the week Phyllis filed her cease and desist. Rick Kingsley lost his contractor's license and pled guilty to a lesser fraud charge, sentenced to 18 months, and ordered to personally repay $200,000 of the total restitution jointly with Marsha. Colton Reese, the attorney who'd sent Dorothy her illegal foreclosure notice, was referred to the state bar for disciplinary review and voluntarily surrendered his license rather than face a hearing. Every homeowner who'd paid the special assessment, including Dorothy Callahan, received a full refund from the restitution fund plus statutory interest within 4 months. Dorothy's lien was dissolved the same week Marsha was arrested. At the next HOA meeting, held fittingly in the same folding chair community centre, packed for the first time in memory, the residents of Willow Creek Estates elected Dorothy Callahan as their new president, 41 votes to 2, and gave her a standing ovation that lasted long enough to embarrass her. I drive past the old pond site most evenings now. The concrete's been jackhammered out, county required it as part of the restoration order, and I've started refilling the basin from the spring the way Otto intended, slow and steady, 4 acres of muddy water climbing back toward what it used to be. Dorothy comes out some Sundays, sits in a chair by the bank with her oxygen tank, and tells me Frank would have loved watching this. I believe her. I think about the lesson in this more than I expected to. A right on paper is only as strong as the person willing to stand on it. A community's trust is the easiest thing in the world to steal, and the hardest thing to rebuild once somebody's proven willing to steal it. And water, like truth, always finds the low ground eventually. You can dam it, drain it, hide it behind a clipboard for a while, but sooner or later it goes exactly where the law and gravity always said it would. Last week, a certified letter showed up from a developer 3 counties over, wanting to know if the Dunmore family might be interested in leasing water rights for a new subdivision going in near Fredericksburg. Same spring system, same aquifer, same kind of paperwork nobody bothers reading until it's far too late. I haven't opened it yet. It sits on Otto's old desk now, next to the ledger, next to my laptop, and every time I walk past it, I think about the way paper works in this business, how a thing can look like nothing, an envelope, a signature line, and still hold enough weight to drown a man or save a town, depending on who's holding it and what they know. I think back on the courtroom the day Marcia was sentenced, how different she looked without the clipboard, without the Range Rover keys jingling in her hand. She wore a plain grey suit her lawyer picked out, something meant to read as humble, and it didn't fool anybody in that gallery. Dorothy sat 2 rows behind the prosecution table, oxygen tank parked at her feet, and when the judge read out the restitution figure, $839,000, joint and several between Marcia and Rick, I watched Dorothy's hands fold together in her lap, not in triumph exactly, more like relief finally arriving somewhere it could rest. Marcia turned around once before the bailiff walked her out for processing and looked straight at me. I expected anger. What I got instead was something closer to confusion, like she still, even then, couldn't fully understand how a man in a 12-year-old truck and boots worn soft at the heel had taken apart $2.5 million of careful planning without ever raising his voice. I didn't feel triumphant either, if I'm honest. I felt tired, the way you feel after a long branding day, when the work's done right, but there's no parade waiting at the end of it, just quiet and the knowledge that it needed doing. The first Willow Creek meeting under Dorothy's presidency ran 2 hours longer than scheduled, because for once people actually wanted to speak. A man named Gus Whitfield, retired from the Air Force, stood up and asked why it had taken this long for anyone to look at the books. A younger mother, Priya Anand, asked whether the association could set up a resident water safety committee, and Dorothy, still getting used to the gavel, laughed and said that sounded like exactly the kind of committee this neighborhood should have had from day one. Somebody brought a sheet cake, somebody else brought sweet tea in a dispenser shaped like a barrel, and Deke, the foreman from that first Thursday, the one who couldn't meet my eyes over the bulldozer, showed up uninvited, stood in the back near the folding chairs, and told me afterward, quiet, that he'd quit Kingsley Premier the week after the arrest. Wasn't right, he said. Knew it wasn't right the whole time. Didn't have the nerve to say so. I told him a lot of people didn't, and that showing up tonight counted for something. He nodded like he wanted to believe that, and maybe by the end of the evening, watching Dorothy hand out the treasurer's report herself, page by page, in plain language anybody could follow, he did. I still go up to the rise most evenings, past the graves, down to the basin where the water's climbing back a few inches at a time. Cattails have started up along the east edge already, faster than I expected, and a pair of herons have taken to fishing the shallows, same as they used to when I was a boy. Otto used to say water remembers its own path, no matter how long you keep it away, and standing there most nights, watching the spring push up through mud that had been dry concrete not so long ago, I believe him more than I ever have. The letter from the Fredericksburg developer is still sealed, sitting where I left it, and some nights I catch myself glancing at it like it might open itself. I know enough about how these things start. A polite inquiry, a generous number, a stranger who hasn't yet learned what kind of paperwork sits quiet in a drawer at the county courthouse, waiting on somebody to finally read it.